Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our CCPL lunchtime series. Today, it's my pleasure. I'm Fazana Azam from the Faculty of Law and CCPL, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ben Capell. Ben is has a doctorate from ESADE, and he's also the head researcher for a very interesting academic research unit called the Future of Work. I'm a labour lawyer by background, actually, so it's particularly interesting to me, this whole concept about how we prepare for the future and what is the future of tomorrow's workplace. Ben has been looking at his sort of area of research really is drivers of inclusion in Asian global cities. And he's looked at Hong Kong, Shanghai, Kuala Lumpur, Taipei, and Singapore, specifically as jurisdictions that he's focused on. And specifically the idea of the movement behind equal rights for gay and lesbian people in the workplace. So I won't say much more, but I hope that's sort of given you a taste of what's to come, and I'll hand over to Ben. Now, I think the way that we would like to run today's session is for Ben to start off, and then there's going to be a short sort of interlude at one point for reflection, and during that time, I'd invite the audience to ask any questions that they might have, because we'll probably then head straight to the end, and we won't have too much time for questions at the end. But so that's the format we'd like to follow. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Very glad to be with you here today and to talk about this paper, which is about the struggle for sexual minority rights in different geographies in Asia. I think today is a very special day. It's the Human Rights Day. So I think we have a topic that is very, very relevant. I had the pleasure to work on this research while I was doing my fellowship at the HKU at the CCPL, where I had the fortune to meet Pooja Kapai, the director of the center, and Shirif Al-Gabaili, Dr. Shirif Al-Gabaili, the research officer. And this is a project that we worked on for a few months. And what we tried to do here is to learn about the struggle for sexual minority rights in different places. And we know it's not an easy struggle. And draw from that conclusions that could serve other groups of activists fighting for human rights at different places. I'll give a short introduction to what we'll do today. So we'll talk about the learnings that we have from the research that we've done, and we focus on 5 different geographies. We focus on Hong Kong, Mainland China, Malaysia, Singapore, and Taiwan, and we'll see that they are very different, and at the same time there are some similarities. And at the end, we draw recommendations. We draw recommendations that we hope will be useful for many other groups fighting for human rights. The reason that we looked into different geographies, different regions, is because we believe that while we can have constitutional guarantees for equality, at the same time, the advancement of human rights, especially in this specific area, will depend a lot on the cultural and the political context, meaning that the way societies, the way the culture, the way politics are, will have an important implication for the movement for sexual minority rights, human rights, and the efforts going forward and the success that we will see. So how did we go about the methodology? How did we gather the data? We started with roughly 30 interviews that we'd had with activists in all these 5 regions. And then we went to we did a literature review. We looked into academic papers and also news, because there are a lot of things that keep on changing, so it was important for us to stay updated. We already, during the interview stage, we saw a big difference. For example, it was very easy to recruit people for interviews in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, less in China, and much less in Malaysia, just for example. And this is an interdisciplinary project. My background, and thank you for the introduction, is actually from the space of human resources, so leadership development, diversity management at work, not so much from the legal aspect. And for that, I had, as I mentioned, the fortune to consult with Pooja and Sharif. And just one final point before moving into the paper itself, the research itself. The paper is not 100% complete, meaning there is some gap still that we're still finalizing it, few final conclusions, and it will be very useful for us to get your questions, to get your ideas, and even if there are any doubts, feel free to bring them up. It will be very useful for us to be able to incorporate your views. What we know is that the rights for sexual minorities moved center stage. So if we think about maybe 20 or 30 years ago even, this was not such a big topic. Gradually, this is becoming a very important topic. And I find here a quote from Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General for the UN, and this is a speech that he delivered 5 years ago. And you can see that, as he mentions, we reject discrimination in general, and in particular, actually use the word in particular, discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And he actually talks about the fact that sometimes there might be some tension between culture and universal rights, and the rights should carry the day. So basically, we should, when there is a tension, when there is conflict, we should move towards protecting the human rights. And we also know there's been great progress over the last few years. So for instance, I came here, the University of Esada is actually, it's in Europe, it's in Spain, all over Europe, there are laws to anti-discrimination laws on the basis of sexual orientation. Some places also on the basis of gender identity, marriage equality in various states. In Europe, just for instance, and in the US, we know about that same-sex marriage are now legalized in the country. But while we might feel that there is a tendency is very positive in the sense of extending human rights, we also know that it's not the full picture. Here is a map. It's pretty updated. It's for May. And what we can see here, the countries that are marked in dark green, these are places where you have marriage equality. Then we move into the places where you see light green, so you have different types of levels of recognition of same-sex relationships. And if we move into the more of the green, pink, orange, and obviously red, this is with different degrees of discrimination. And in some countries, actually, there could be death penalty on the basis of homosexuality. So this is, you can see some kind of a degree. What's interesting here is that you actually have countries, and the US is a good example, where people achieved marriage equality. In the same time, you can have still discrimination can be legal. So you can have a very strange case in the US, for instance, that a same-sex couple will get married. They register the marriage, and when they come back home, when they go to work on the next day, they get fired for their relationship. So it's still, there's a lot of work to do in different places. At the same time, as I mentioned, I will focus on these 5 regions. So Mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore. For the interest of time, I will focus mainly on Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. Yet I understand there could be interest in learning more about Malaysia and Mainland China, and this is the space where we go to the Q&A. So this is where I invite you to say, I'd like to know more about Malaysia, and then we can talk about Malaysia. This slide could be a little bit overwhelming. I'll take it step by step. And the reason that we looked into these 5 different regions is because there are similarities and differences. I mentioned already that I don't come from a legal background. You probably guess I was actually not born in Asia, so this was a lot of learning for me. And I hope that I reflect well here what the final conclusions. And this is just to set the context. So these are not the conclusion of the study. So first of all, if we look into the topic of criminalization, so we know that in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Malaysia, under the British rule, there was the penal code criminalizing homosexuality. And in Hong Kong, it's the 377, in Singapore, 377A, and then in Malaysia, we have various variations of that. In Hong Kong, the 377, the penal code was struck down. That was in 1991. And then in Singapore and in Malaysia, the law still holds. What's interesting is that in Malaysia, actually, on top or besides the law criminalizing homosexuality, we also have Sharia laws that would put extra pressure on sexual minorities. It's important also to mention that the law, the 377A, only referred to male homosexuality, so it's actually excluded lesbian from being, relationship from being criminalized. Then in mainland China, there was never actually a law criminalizing explicitly homosexuality. Rather, there was a law against hooliganism that was a broad term to include behaviors that the government considered to be antisocial, and many times homosexuality was actually considered part of that. And this existed till 1997. And then we have Taiwan. There was actually never a law criminalizing homosexuality. And that's the only place that we actually see legislation against discrimination these days. In terms of political system, at least on the paper, what we know that in Hong Kong there is limited democracy, so there is democracy, but we know the whole struggle that we had over the last year or two. We know that there are some, it's not a complete democracy, there's no real popular vote, so some degrees. We know in mainland China, obviously not, it's a one-party system, two power layers, very important. We have the state and we have the provinces that have a lot of freedom. Singapore, multi-party popular vote. And then we have Malaysia, multi-party popular vote, and three power layers, because we only have also have a monarch. And then we look into Taiwan, which is a multi-party and a popular vote system. Another important element to look at is the degree of civic activism, because that's very important. We will talk today about activism. So in Hong Kong, it's quite high. We have, it's okay. People can do protest. You can say, everyone is successful with the final results. That's a debate. But in the sense of there is a way to protest, there is a way to complain, there is a way to organize a manifestation. So, and actually, I came to Hong Kong. I'm here for about a year and a half, and it's pretty vibrant, at least in my eyes. When we move to mainland China, obviously this is very limited because it's very difficult to challenge the state in mainland China. Singapore, very limited. Although it's a democracy, there are plenty of laws to make sure that people don't challenge the government. In Malaysia, it's becoming more and more limited. So Malaysia is going through a process of conservatism, process where the government is becoming more sectarian, meaning almost it's ethnical politics, and they use more and more the laws in the system to put pressure on activism. So in a way, Malaysia is moving away from democracy, even though it's still people can still vote there. And then Taiwan, we know there is also a very vibrant arena for social movements. Another part that is very interesting is the tradition. So Hong Kong, Singapore, mainland China, and Taiwan, we can say that some degree is part of the of Confucius word, meaning Confucian tradition. And why is it important? Because we have here respect for parents, respect for society, respect for authority, and the importance of continued family bloodline. So all this is very important and could put gays and lesbians under some pressure, of course, and especially in China, because in China there is, under the one-child policy, there is even more pressure on making sure that the couple bring grandchildren. So you have a lot of same-sex partnerships. Sometimes, actually, people would marry. It would be an arrangement where a gay would marry a lesbian in China just to make both parties to make sure the parents are happy, but then have their own relationships aside. But what is very interesting in the case of China is that because the country is mostly atheist, and because in the Confucian tradition, there is no such a divine religious entity like you'll find, for example, in Christianity, in Islam, or in Judaism, so that you don't have really passionate religious lobbies fighting against progress. It's more the individual level. And these groups, there are groups that actually put quite a lot of fight against the progress of rights for sexual minorities. You will find them, in Hong Kong, Singapore, obviously Malaysia, where it's a very conservative society by now, and also in Taiwan lately. So we have this matrix, and we plotted the different regions on that matrix, and you can see just for reference point, so at the top corner over there, let's say it's San Francisco, okay, just for as an example. And this is where we plotted the different regions. So I can stop for a second here and ask you, is there any doubts, any surprises, any questions about how we see it? So on one hand, we hear the democracy and civic society. We see that China will be at the bottom, Singapore, still very low level of democracy, especially because you don't have much of you cannot actually protest against the government. Malaysia, we move up to Hong Kong, and then when we see the degree over there, it's societal support. So in Taiwan, the society is quite supportive. And when we see China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, that's the way we analyzed the context. Any questions, doubts? Yes?
For Malaysia, in terms of democracy and civil society, you're talking about the democratic environment for civil society or the institutional structure of democracy?
Okay, it's a very good point. So to make it quite simple, we actually combine the two into, let's say, one parameter. I agree. I totally agree with that. At the same time, if we combine also civic society, we'll see that these days, and I want to say this is contextualized for specifically the area that is related to sexual minority rights. So in Hong Kong, for instance, while we have less democracy, it's okay to have a pride parade, for instance, but in Malaysia, it's no way these days. So it's very contextualized, and it's kind of a mix. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Any other doubts or questions? Okay. I mentioned that I will look into 3 areas, and then Q&A, we can look into others. I'd like to start with Hong Kong, and I feel I'd like to reflect what were the main conclusions of my learnings about Hong Kong. What we see is that in Hong Kong, there is a progress mostly via civil and juridical mechanism versus legislation. That's especially since 1991. So the big question for me was, what happened in 1991? Why it was possible to decriminalize homosexuality in 1991, and why we don't see any progress since that point on? And there is a reason, at least the way it comes out to us from the facts. So, first of all, before the 1980s, there was hardly any discussion in Hong Kong about the topic of sexual minority rights. It was not a political discussion. But in 1980, there is a famous case, which is the Mclennan Case. Anyone heard of it? So Mclennan Case, it was a Scottish police inspector, and he feared there was chances that his sexuality will be revealed, and he apparently commits suicide. And that was kind of a shock that was all over the media, and that starts to bring the debate and the importance of making people feel more comfortable and what's going on in the society. Few years later, we have the establishment of the 10%, and the 10% is an activist group in Hong Kong at that time. It was, I think, the first activist group that is very organized. And 2 years later, now we move into 1998, they come up with a manifesto for basically discussing the importance of of protecting sexual minorities in Hong Kong. And now we enter a perfect storm, in a way. I think that made it possible in 1991 to decriminalize homosexuality. And why is it a perfect storm? On one hand, there is more conscious. There is more. We have activist groups are becoming more organized. They come up with concrete claims. And at the same time, we are getting close to the date of the handover of Hong Kong from the British government to the Chinese government. I was actually a young kid at the time, and I was living somewhere else, but I still remember it was a big moment, and there was a lot of anxiety actually happening in Hong Kong at that time, because it's a big change, and around that time there is a Tiananmen crackdown, so now the whole topic of human rights, it's becoming a very big issue. There's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of uncertainty, And around this time, another thing happened in Hong Kong, which is here in Hong Kong, we start playing with the notion of democracy. So in 1991, there is actually the first direct elections, only 18 legislators, but it's still the topic of the notion of democracy penetrates, grows. We have activist groups, and we have a lot of uncertainty, and there is a feeling of the society that we must protect human rights. And in 1991, there is the Bill of Rights of Hong Kong. And it's not by coincidence that a few months later we have the decriminalization of homosexuality in Hong Kong, because now the 377, the penal code, is incompatible with the Bill of Rights. So now there is decriminalization. And from that point, 25 years, we don't see hardly any legal progress. So there was this critical point, and what happens is then we look into it now. So activist work since that point mostly center on awareness activities, and we have a lot of initiatives in Hong Kong. The Pink Dot that many of you might know. We have the Pride Parade, we have the Pink Season, so a lot of activities. There are different studies, some of them coming from this university, some of them coming from other universities and other organizations, so studies to check how people feel about equal rights, marriage equality, and so forth. There is a work of recruitment of legislators. So in Hong Kong, when I talk with activists, what I understood, it's very difficult to mobilize society or to put pressure on legislators in direct elections because it's not a popular vote. So legislators, in a way, can avoid the topic. But there is a way to create more sympathy, and activists actually set up meetings with many legislators, trying to explain them and convince them to support the cause. Liaison with the business community. This is very special for Hong Kong. It's an international global business hub, and a lot of companies here that have a lot of power. We have for instance, the Out on the Street event. We have companies, for instance, like HSBC and Goldman Sachs, very important in this, here in Hong Kong, are actively supporting gays and lesbian rights. And then we have progress in the courts. And I think this is what makes the progress in Hong Kong very, very special. So what we see in Hong Kong, we don't see since 1991 any big leap, but what we see here is that progressively, through the courts, sexual minorities' rights are expanding. And here is just a few examples. So Luang versus Secretary of Justice. So here we have an individual challenging the law that says that consensual sex for heterosexual and actually also lesbians will be from the age of 16, but for homosexuals, it's from the age of 21. So he said here there is discrimination by the law, and there is a case, and at the end, the courts decide to harmonize the law. So now the consent age is now 16 for everyone. And then we have another case. It's roughly around the same year, Secretary of Justice versus Yao Yuk Long. So here we have a case where the police arrest two men for having sex in a park, and they accuse them for sodomy. And what happens is that they challenge the arrest, they challenge the accusation, basically saying that the police arrest them only for them being male and homosexual males. And then the court says, yes, you're right. And again, we expand, they support Yao Yuk Long and the other person, we don't know his name, and we expand rights once more. And then in 2013, we have the case of W versus Register of Marriage. So here it's, we have a transgender person, a male, that changed her sex to a woman, and she wants to marry, and at the beginning she cannot. She wants to marry her boyfriend. And the case is brought to court, and it's very interesting that the court says that they should be able to marry, and even though it could be that a lot part of the society will be against it, and they recognize that there is a need to protect human rights in this case, similar to what we saw from Ban Ki-moon from the statement, and then the marriage goes forward. So what other advancements do we see since that point in Hong Kong? We see advancement through non-binding policies and codes, and probably, that's not enough, but that's a way for the government to avoid the topic of legislation. So they say we cannot, maybe we fear, whatever reasons they have, not to confront the strong lobby against legislation. So there is a non-binding policy. It's kind of a code of conduct. I think the first one came up in 1998. Saying how companies should behave, how employers should behave, but it's not binding. It's not a real law. Then there is a very interesting case when it comes to domestic violence ordinance. So till I think it's 1989, correct? Yeah, sorry? 85. The domestic violence ordinance was only covered a couple, men and women, but then there is a need to expand it into a desire to expand it also to cover same-sex relationships. And there is a strong debate because there is a fear of what is called the slippery slope, meaning that, we approve that, and then next thing they will ask us to approve marriage, and next thing they will ask us to approve anti-discrimination. But there was a very delicate negotiations, and at the end there was a formula that it's now the ordinance is called domestic violence, domestic and cohabitation violence, meaning that on one hand sexual minorities are protected against violence, at the same time we don't use the word marriage or partnership. So that was a formula, and that came through negotiations. And in mainland China, actually, they used the same approach in various provinces. In addition, we have an advisory board, which is set by the government about a year ago, and it's the second time that they set some kind of an advisory board where you have different parties to discuss and look to find solutions. And last thing is changing public opinion. We do see that the public opinion in Hong Kong is becoming more favorable. There is more acceptance of same-sex relationship. We have more acceptance that there is a need to protect gays and lesbians against discrimination. So that's Hong Kong, and I mentioned I will go over, cover also Singapore and Taiwan, which are very, very different stories. So in Singapore, the way that there is a paper, very interesting one by Chua. She's a scholar based in Singapore, and she described the way of the activist work in Singapore as pragmatic resistance, which is basically navigating, making progress in a very tight and controlled environment. And the government in Singapore has an approach, has a doctrine, and they call it, it's titled illiberal pragmatism. They acknowledge the presence of gay community, and some countries will not even do that. So they say, yes, we do have a gay community here. It's okay to have gay establishments. It's okay to discuss the fact that there is sexual diversity in Singapore. Yet, as long as there is no threat to public order. And there is a speech by Prime Minister Lee of Singapore that in 2007, and it's a long speech, and it talks about the topic. Basically says, as you can see, they too must have place in this society, and they too are entitled to the private lives. Basically, he also says that the 377A will not be enforced in Singapore. That's part of the discussion. But homosexuals should not set the tone for Singaporean society. Basically say, don't mess with public order, don't challenge the government, you can have your private life, you can do it, we won't mess with that, but this is the kind of the status quo. Yet reaching this status quo, there is a journey to get there, and hopefully, obviously it will change, but here is what we know about Singapore. So there was a very tight control, and this happens till the 1980s, but then what happened in Singapore, there is a growing middle class and more exposure, and people want to have greater rights, and I think we'll see the same actually happening in mainland China. And there is the PMP, the leading party, they lose popularity. So now they lose popularity, and now they need to find a way to make the people more happy, and they start to provide greater liberties. So for example, if someone would like to make a speech at the main park, there is a speaker corner, now they don't need to get a request from the police. They can need to register still, but no need to get permission from the police. So there is some greater liberty. At the same time, we get internet is entering Singapore, that's in the 1990s, and we see gradual activism. We see it starts to form. At the beginning, it's more about HIV prevention, but there is more kind of sense that there is something happening there. Sometimes it's only in forums, online forums. Sometimes it manifests itself in different ways. And then in 2003, we have Lee, the prime minister that is quoted above. He gets elected, and Singapore now is going through a transformation. It's changing from being kind of industrial to post-industrial society. They actually look for creative, create a creative space. They want to bring international talent. They want to create a new vision for Singapore, at least facing the world. Meaning Singapore is a vibrant, cosmopolitan place. And to get that, they understand that they cannot keep on having the same approach for gays and lesbian and sexual diversity. So they start to find a new status quo, and that's the speech that I mentioned earlier. Within that framework, we start to see some things happening in Singapore, and one of them is the Pink Dot event that is very famous in Asia, and actually I think worldwide by now. And this is not the typical event we will see in Hong Kong. So it's not a quest for rights, and this is very important to mention here. The people coming to the Pink Dot event are not asking to change the law. They're saying it's under the umbrella of inclusive Singapore. So we are gays, we are part of the society. They try to make the society, try to create more empathy, and while not challenging the government. So and the government lets it happen because there's no challenge. And what the government in a way says that if we see that society advances towards the point that it will not be an issue to legalize homosexuality and to have a law to anti-discriminate, we will agree to that. But don't ask us to do it. There was an assumption in Singapore that the courts will actually agree that the 377A is unconstitutional, and in 2014, there are two cases brought to court, but the courts in Singapore apparently are much less independent than we'll have in Hong Kong, and the decision of the courts is actually, it's not a role to touch legislation. So our role is here to enforce legislation, or when there is a case, we'll interpret the case based on the law. If you want to change legislation, go back to the parliament. So that was the case in Singapore. So what happens in Singapore? We see activism is operating within restricted space, meaning HIV prevention, that's very well accepted, and it could be an organization that is a LGBT organization that is, people know that it's an LGBT organization, but the focus is HIV prevention. And this is the baseline, by the way. So if you look into mainland China, there are many organizations that offer HIV prevention activities. In China, we can have few other things like Beijing Film Festival and so forth. If we go to Malaysia, that's the only space where you can actually have activities. So HIV prevention, everyone would agree it's important. So that's the baseline. That's from where we start, actually. Then you'll have public awareness activities under the title of Inclusive Singapore. And then the last thing is we have progress through courts. And I mentioned that there is no way to change the legislation, but I also mentioned up front we have the topic of pragmatic resistance, and I think it's quite fascinating the way it is done in Singapore. So here think of a situation where the police raids a gay club. It's actually Case, the Rascal Gay Club, and the police can arrest people that are not carrying their ID. So now we have the police arrest the people at the club. Many do not carry their ID, but some do. So now a gay activist will take the court, actually send a complaint letter to the police saying that the fact that they arrested him while he was carrying the ID, they actually challenge the authority of the government. So they don't say, you interfere with my private life. They say, you are actually undermining the rule of law of Singapore, and the police sends an apology letter. Then another case will be that someone is arrested, let's say, for having homosexual relationship, and they will say, they will not challenge the law, but they will say, hey, a few years ago, Prime Minister Lee said that they will not enforce 377A, but you just did. So you undermine what the Prime Minister did. And then the police will scale down. So they're kind of expanding the freedom by not challenging the the government. And let me go now to the final case, which I think it's also very interesting, and that's Taiwan. And in Taiwan, we see that gay and lesbian rights, the biggest achievement is that in Taiwan, gay and lesbian rights became a political agenda topic. So it's a mainstream topic that candidates and the public discuss. And that's how I think they made a lot of progress, because that allows, in a place where you can have actually people vote for candidates, it's a popular vote, it actually puts pressure on candidates, because that's a topic that's important for the society, and to win votes, they need to respond to society demands. But again, like in other places, it doesn't just happen. So till 1987, in Taiwan, we have a martial rule. That ends in 1987, and now we have huge passion in the society to become more enlightened. There is a lot of social movements, a lot of discussions about protection of the rights of groups that are more vulnerable. So that's a big thing. That's from one day to the next, the society is becoming a democracy with a lot of interest in the topic. And there's another thing is we remember that Taiwan is looking for recognitions for many, many years, looking for protection, for instance, from the US. So I'll mention how that plays alone. And now we see, in the early 1990s, we see a lot of interest in the society. There is this connection between human rights and minority rights. And there are a few incidents that are critical. In 1990, there is the World News incident. So here we have a networking event of lesbians in Taiwan. And there is a group of TV crew, it's a TTV, I think, channel, and they infiltrate into the networking event, and they take photos, they take videos, and the way they edit it makes it look very seedy. They actually very manipulated the report, and they broadcast that, and suddenly there is an uproar. It starts with the lesbian groups, but it ends up by actually bringing together human rights activists and celebrities. And the society aligns with the protest, and that's become a big media item of the protest against the TTV broadcast. A few years later, Taipei government, the city governments, they do a project. It's called there are different names for it, but it's Taipei Park cleanup or crackdown, and they try to change make some changes, urban changes in a park, and part of it, they start to crack down on gay couples that were used to go to the park to meet. And suddenly there is a huge protest against the government kind of the day, in the sense saying that they ignore, they try to delete the homosexual heritage of the park and of Taipei in general. And again, we have not just gay activists that are there at the protest. We see the whole huge part of the society that is sensible for human rights are supporting them. And we talked about perfect storm. So now we have in 1996, we have the first elections in Taiwan, and now politicians already understand that sexual minority rights is a human rights issue and people care about that. So the opposition, the DPP, they actually explicitly support lesbian and gay rights ahead of the elections. They do not win the elections in 1996, but they do win them in 2000. And the KMT, which is now it will be the opposition, they react and they sponsor the first gay parade in Taipei. So now the two big parties, they are in a way pitching to get the general population support for themselves by saying we support gay rights is part of human rights, and you care about that, and we care about that. 2003, there is a proposed marriage legislation. It didn't pass. I do mention that for Taiwan, it's very important to get the world recognition. They try to distance themselves from mainland China in a way to tell many countries we are a pluralistic society, we are a multicultural society, we respect minority rights. The proposed marriage legislation came just few days or maybe few weeks before the Prime Minister of Taiwan actually goes to the US to receive a prize for human rights. So at least in few places, let's say it's not by coincidence. It does not pass, but in 2004 we finally have anti-discrimination policies legislation in Taiwan, and it specifically regards employment in school. And what happened since then? Not a great deal when it comes to legislation, But in 2010, we have, there is another incident. The government, the city of Taipei, they come up with common homophobic directive to schools, kind of trying to prevent homosexuality. Again, the population lines up behind the gay rights and under the topic of human rights, and the government of Taipei, they agreed to change the textbooks to make them more, less discriminatory and to educate on sexual diversity. And last, we see that shortly after the US court legalized same-sex marriage, in Taiwan they say, oh, so we agree now. And they don't agree for marriage yet, but they agree to have same-sex partnership, and they will work on that now. So that's another incident. Overall achievement is accepting society overall. We have also lobbies fighting against it, but it's overall. And we have multiple initiatives to promote same-sex marriage, actually politicians that clearly say that they will do that. So I think it will happen in Taiwan, probably the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. Okay, we let it download for a second. And then I simply talk about the main conclusions and recommendations. So the main conclusion is we see that societal and democratic context conditions the viable options for activism. So we see, for instance, in Taiwan, a very vibrant society, democracy with a lot of interest in human rights and popular vote. So there are a lot of options. We see in Hong Kong, there are less options. The courts are independent. You can make progress through courts, but you cannot put direct pressure through elections on legislators. So there are less options, but still a lot of activities happening. And then we start to go to Singapore and in China and Malaysia, where you have less and less options how to make progress. So the context is really critical. In Malaysia, for example, you have the democratic institutions, as you rightly mentioned, but the society will not let activists make any progress. Then we see how it is important to leverage emerging opportunities in critical incidents. So we can here talk, for example, about everything I just mentioned about Taiwan. For instance, about the fact there is an incident and the activists are able to capitalize on it and progress through that. We can also see in Singapore the unlawful arrests that are used in a way that are capitalized to expand rights. We have the situation in Hong Kong, for instance, the handover to China creates uncertainty, creates anxiety, creates understanding that there is a need to protect human rights. So that's another pivotal moment. The court elections, the court decision in the US and so forth. So there are moments in history that create an opportunity, and it's critical to capitalize, recognize them, and capitalize on these moments. And the other last main bullet point is that we need to reframe issues to appeal to greater public. So just saying, oh, sexual minority rights, it's probably will have little impact, but if we say human rights, like they do in Taiwan, like it happened in Hong Kong in 1991, like we talk about prevention against HIV in many other geographies, if we talk about the importance of having a creative hub for talent in Singapore for the sake of the country economy, then we can have a bigger argument. So that's another thing, to reframe the issue so it won't be just about one specific group, but it will appeal to a larger public. So 3 main recommendations. So first of all, avoid limiting actions toward the linear progression model, meaning we see that in some places it's possible to move from, let's say, from legalization to marriage equality, like in the case of the US, without passing through anti-discrimination. So in a way, in Asia, what we notice is so far the progress is very linear, but maybe there is a way actually to work in different ways, so to try to get rights. In this case, we're talking about marriage, but not necessarily going first through anti-discrimination. Just an example. We said about connect to the needs and value of the larger population. So what are the values? What are that it's important that we can identify, that it's important to connect to? How can we reframe it in a way that more people will be sympathized with the cause? So they won't say, oh, I'm not gay, I'm not lesbian, this is not, it has nothing to do with me. What they will say, oh, I actually care about this or care about that, and this is related. I'll now see how it is related. And we know that in Taiwan, which is a perfect example for that, there are people that actually don't approve of same-sex relationship, but they do relate to the topic of human rights. So they would say, even though I personally don't accept homosexuality as something normalized, but human rights is important for me, therefore I support that candidate. And of course, make the best out of emerging critical incidents, like we talked briefly a few minutes ago. I will let that slide to, I will have there in a second, I'll go there just so you can look at it. I won't go through it, it's just too much details, but as the last recommendation that I'd like to make here is the one that above all, never lose hope. So there is always a rainbow after a storm, and it's possible to make progress, and it's not an easy struggle, and there's still way to, you know, it requires persistency and dedication, and it will happen at the end. So, thank you.
Many thanks, Ben. Can I open up the floor to questions? Any questions from the floor? I have one question, actually. It's interesting because you come from this sort of HR leadership work background, organizational development background. Do you feel that actually the modern day workplace is much better at focusing on the broader issues? So as you were talking through that last piece, it struck me that a lot of organizations deal with sort of sexual orientation rights within the broader diversity and inclusion framework. So that's just one of a number of multiple issues that they will focus on. And I think that's quite a sort of smart way of getting perhaps some people within the organization who don't approve or whose religion is to almost, they're compelled to engage with that issue. So do you think they're sort of better at doing that than other approaches or in other areas of society?
I think what I see is that there is definitely progress at the workplace, and I see different progress at different places. So the way I got into that topic is actually I was working at that time and for it was a big corporation, and I was working there of diversity, and I was suddenly I got a contact, a call from one of employees. He was gay, he was based in France, and he told me, you know, how about we do more work on the gays LGBT inclusion, and I was surprised because we, you know, most corporations in the world, like 90+%, at least the ones that are coming from, I would say the Western part of the world, they will have a non-discrimination policy that includes sexual orientation. But apparently, even though we had the policies, there were different pockets, different places where you will have employees would be afraid to come out at work. They would still be afraid that maybe if they come out at work, they will get less opportunities in the company. So we did work, and I see that many companies are doing a lot of work, and I think there is progress. I see that see it happening. I think it's a slow progress, but it is happening. Now there are legislation, there are anti-discrimination policies in many organizations. Yeah. The challenge is more cultural now, I think.
I mean, just sort of from an anecdotal perspective, what I've seen in Hong Kong is that they're again, I don't have very reliable data on this, but from what I've spoken to people about, that people are comfortable coming out in the workplace, but not necessarily at home and with their families. Which I find quite
yeah, that's interesting, and that's reverse to what you'll find in most of the Western countries, actually. So that was quite almost shocking for me to hear that in some countries people will be out at work and not in the private life. So if you go to Europe, for instance, so it's people will be out in the private lives and then will think twice if they should come out at work. But what you will see in a lot of corporate organizations, because they have anti-discrimination policies, people will actually test the water of coming out. But I want to say one thing that it's important. If we're talking about the privileged, we're talking about the ones that are anyway, they might be expats or they might not be, but they probably make a very good salary. They work for top organizations. We're not talking about the person that might work in a family business in Hong Kong. They will not be out at work as well. So I think it's important to just recognize we're probably talking about a very small percentage. Yeah.
And you're right, and it's within the large multinational corporations who have a very established track record, actually, of you know, incorporating those rights and policies in their practices. Any questions from the floor?
Mm. And I tell you that when after I came to Hong Kong, I went to the Out on the Street event, and on one hand I felt, wow, this is great, it's a great event, and you have Goldman Sachs and HSBC and, you know, all the Ernst & Young and all. And then a few days later I started to feel a little bit, in a way, sad because the crowd that came there, they're all privileged. We're talking about people that anyway, you know, they got the full package almost. So yes, for this crowd that would go to this fancy hotel and will have presentation by the CEOs, yes, they have anti-discrimination policy in the organization. But what about the 99% that are not in that space? So it's very nice to have this discussion in these beautiful ballrooms, but is it relevant for the rest?
And okay, sort of following on from that then, there's part of me also when I was listening to the, you know, your findings and your recommendations, and I sort of get the, I almost rail against the suggestion that we should sort of somehow, if you like, not be saying, well, this is different, but we are demanding these rights. You know, we almost have to sort of play with and along with the system. So in Singapore, for example, or Malaysia, I mean, of course, that's the reality of the situation, but I find that quite sad. I find it disturbing that you can't be a bit more militant about it. Is that just what we have to do in these parts of the world?
I guess if I don't want to encourage anyone to get arrested, then the thing is that I find it quite interesting in Asia in that sense, and probably not only in Asia, but so in the European Union, it's a union, and there are some charters that are, you can have them discussed at the European Union Council, and then they are forced on all the other countries. So you almost don't need to go to, let's say, just for instance, Poland or Croatia or some country where they won't pass a law, and you say, oh, you need to. Rather, they say, we agreed as 27 members, you need to implement that also. And in Asia, even though we have the ASEAN, it's probably, you know, it's something that's quite new. There is you need to go country by country, and it's very, even in Singapore, activists actually, and also in Malaysia, will try to make sure they don't seem as connected to international activist groups because it will put them at risk. So from pragmatic perspective, the minute that the governments in these places will feel that they're being threatened by international pressure, the activists actually will probably face risks. So.
I can just chime in on that. You know, I'm always fascinated by the space between activism and pragmatism, and I think, as we all know, you know, being in Asia means it's not just about getting the right thing done for the right reasons. Sometimes you have to be very pragmatic about what's going to be acceptable as a way of moving a conversation forward. And what really comes back to mind is the experience of the amendment of the Domestic Violence Ordinance, which I think is quite heartwarming because it tells you people do have a heart. Right? Because that's the ultimate sort of argument that was made, that everyone deserves equal protection against violence. And it shouldn't matter what your sexuality is. And I think that's how cohabiting relationships came to be part of that ordinance. And it was very much that, you know, in fact, it was Christian lobbies who were persuaded, you know, to rely on their compassionate religious selves to think about the problem differently. And I think where you see that kind of cooperation and collaboration, and you see the possibilities there, that suggests that maybe it's not necessary to be so headstrong and say, well, this is about social justice, and this is the language we should use in order to advocate for change.
Right, as long as you get a real progress.
The discourse is important, and we can do that, but there's nothing to stop you from, you know, using the little sort of alleys that get you to that point anyway.
True. Although I sort of hark back to the EOC review, you know, the public consultation process there, and that was just so depressing to me that the EOC, the Equal Opportunities Commission here, rather than taking a very firm stance, said, oh no, we have to go and get public views about whether there should be amendments. And to me, there's a difference there. With activist groups, I agree that there's room for more pragmatism, and creating general public support is very, very important. But for an institution that is supposed to be at the vanguard of equality and rights, not to take a leadership perspective, to me was very disappointing. So I guess, rather than criticize the activists, I would criticize the EOC. Any other questions or observations or comments?
I'm actually quite curious about, do you find any differences for activism in terms of how are they going to advocate for recognition versus they're actually advocating for change in particular policy or welfare issues when we talk about domestic violence? Is there any differences in their pattern of, once you have used the term reframing, so is these two areas, are these two areas actually quite different in their way of activating the general public attention? So they're actually trying to recognize their position as homosexuals or sexual minorities, or actually they are trying to change some policies or legislations, because you're actually trying to divide these two areas.
I agree, and I think again, you think you picked up on something that is kind of leading part of this presentation, is that the way we looked at it here, the Center for Comparative Public Law, so there was a big focus on legislation. I could have made a totally different presentation and say that we look into how you change public opinion and having legislation as a subset of that presentation. Obviously, there is interaction between the two, so a law, in a way, gives some kind of a recognition. So many people say, oh, there is a legislation, so that's part of the law and we should follow the law. And then you have another argument that would say when you change public opinion and then the law will end up changing. So it's a debate. I'm actually not a scholar in the legal field, so I'll feel a bit humbled to answer this question correctly. But I think activists are working in two parallel paths, but I would say that the conclusion is the same, in the sense that to make progress, either in public opinion or in legislation, what it appears to be, that it's critical to reframe it in a way that is talking about a bigger vision. So not just fight for one thing in specific, rather find a way that more people will be supportive of the law or the community. That you see different countries' experience, just like Singapore or Hong Kong. Try to compare these two situations. Yes.
Singaporeans, they're probably trying to recognize the status of sexual minorities in the society, rather than what you have said, challenging the government. But rather in Hong Kong, they are challenging more legislation. I mean, recognition is probably the less important goal. You want to challenge legislation first.
And I think, I come from, we all have our own biases, and I come from, I lived for the last 15 years in Europe, and I remember for one of the projects that I did has to do with diversity, and I interviewed someone that moved to Europe. He actually moved in from Egypt, and there was a case that he had a neighbor it is in Barcelona, and the neighbor was homophobic, and they had a party, so the neighbor complained, and then they came to, they never complained about noise, but then when they came to, there was a court, and the neighbors used the word, said, oh, and they are gays or something like that, and the court, the judge just said, okay, that's enough, that's it, fine, excuse, and they didn't even, because they understood it comes from, homophobic angle. The police acted very respectively, the courts acted very respectively, and that person told me that after he saw that, he saw how the institutions, the police, the court, everything that has to do with the case, followed the legislation, in spirit also. He felt so reassured, imagining someone coming from a country that is actually very conservative. So I think there is this play between legislation, how authorities behave, how community behaves, how people feel protected. So, and that's a bigger topic than my this specific case.
Great.
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
Just one and also that some people are quite averse to the idea of activism and civic participation, because it involves a degree of risk. We are human beings, and to be involved in a political act, as well as a legal act, involves a degree of maybe risk or uncomfortableness for some. Maybe because they may think that it involves risk to privacy or their personal life. So then how do we bring about more activism while respecting people's privacy, their right to privacy and personal intimacy?
I think I think one way to do it, and that's actually I talk about from my experience at corporations. So you'll have, if you have networking groups for gays and lesbians, for instance, they don't call it the networking group for gays and lesbians. They would say an allies, meaning you can be part of that work, not because you're gay or lesbian or transgender. You can be part of that work because you also support the cause. And that diffuses a little bit the identification. So you can be sympathized. For example, if there's a march against breast cancer, you will have men participate. Well, men can get breast cancer, but you will have men there. It doesn't mean that they are women, right? So that's kind of the same thing. So you broaden the definition of who should be there. I think that's one way. And another thing is, most of my work at corporates has to do, well, the academic work had to do with coming out at work. And we still need to understand that it's a private decision. It's not if you go, in some countries, people almost look negatively of someone that they are not coming out at work. They will consider, oh, this person is not authentic, this person is not honest. But we forget that it's also a personal decision. So what we try to do, as you say, create conditions that people will feel more comfortable. Of course, the ones that really fight for the cause, but can we create other reframing it so the other people join, or maybe call it, mention it also for allies. And the Pink Dot is a great event because it's a family event, actually. So you can have brothers and sisters and friends coming over. So, yeah.
Just wonder whether you have any observation as to the attitude of the activists. Because personally, I think those in Hong Kong advocating for LGBT rights sometimes are quite aggressive or even offensive. They curse people in public consultation or starting fights, arguments with religious groups. Whereas actually, what I've seen in Taiwan seems to be happier, and they seem to be more joyful in a sense. And therefore, the society in Taiwan seems to be more acceptable to gays' rights, which is not the case in Hong Kong. Have you got any, or do you have any observations as to their attitude to the achievement they made?
Yeah, so I would answer that, but I would say that's an observation in the sense that that's from what I understood. I hope that I'm right here in my reflection. So if you look into Hong Kong, there is a spectrum of activism, and from what I understood, for example, the gay parade, it continued to be a little bit more militant, for instance, and the Pink Dot, it's more soft, family oriented. And I don't know if people here would agree. That's at least my feeling. So I think there is a spectrum, and then maybe, and the Pink Dot is actually new in Hong Kong. It's only 2 years, and that's more of a soft activism compared to the gay parade. So maybe there is a change of strategy here, understanding that the gay parade doesn't work. It might create some backlash, for instance. We also need to remember that in Hong Kong, and one of the main activists in Hong Kong told me that Hong Kong people are also a little bit tired of protests, and that's what I understood from the interview. So they need to find a way to connect better to the people, because there are been a lot of protests. I'm not talking specifically about the Umbrella Revolution, but in general. So people are already confused with so many protests going on. So the Pink Dot, for instance, I hope it will be successful. That's one way of saying kind of, okay, let's change strategy. We're not protesting. We're creating an event that is connecting better to the people's feeling. But I also like to say that there are probably dynamics going on, and again, this is assumption. So if you go to a place like Taiwan, where there is a religious lobby, but it's not so strong. It's there, but it's not so strong. So maybe people feel from the gay movement, they don't feel so much pressure, so you don't see so much aggression from their side. So probably some dynamics going on, but it's only reflections from my end.
Any other questions? No. Well, thank you very much, Ben. That was very fascinating. If we could all give a round of applause.
Thank you.